Okay, so now we're recording. And welcome everyone, and welcome Holland Hopson, who is our guest presenter today for our 2021 Music Technology Guest Lecture Series or Guest Presentation Series. Let me take a minute to introduce Holland Hopson. He's a sound and media artist, composer and improviser, a multi-instrumentalist. He usually performs on clawhammer, banjo, and electronics. Holland often augments his instruments with custom-designed sensor interfaces and performs with his own highly responsive interactive programs. He's performed in Australia, Europe, and North America, along with notable experimental and outsider musicians, such as Macarthur Genius Award winners Anthony Braxton and George Lewis, live electronics pioneer David Behrman, sonic meditator Pauline Oliveros, mutant trumpeter Ben Neill, network music trailblazer Tim Perkis, free-improv innovators LaDonna Smith and Davey Williams, and others. And right now, Holland is assistant professor of arts entrepreneurship in New College at the University of Alabama and a fellow of the Collaborative Arts Research Initiative, CARI or CARI. Right, so those are really interesting names that we have brought up often in our program. Specifically, George Lewis has come up recently, and so it's pretty exciting to make that connection. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Holland, who we're very grateful and honored to have today to present to us. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. Can somebody say hi so I know you're there?
Hello.
Okay, cool.
Hello.
Yeah, that works.
Hi.
Good. Nice. Here's my plan for what I thought we would do. To first start out with some of where I'm coming from, some motivations for the work that I do, and then to focus in on some different categories of creative work. Follow that up with a semi-rant about arts entrepreneurship, and hopefully this leads to a conversation, which is where you come in. Does this sound good?
I think it sounds excellent.
Okay, great.
Sounds good.
All right.
Heck yes, heck yes.
So I want to start with this concept called learning by making. And I take this from Jenny Gottschalk and her book, Experimental Music Since 1970. She uses this term to talk about an approach to creative work that fits neatly with the work that I do, not just the creative work, but also my academic work and work with arts entrepreneurship. So what does she mean by learning by making? She breaks this up into two ideas. One is this idea that making is making. In other words, the creation of novel tools is an important part of the creation of novel work. And we can even go beyond that philosophically to say that we don't have to make a distinction between, say, making an instrument and composing a piece, or making software and generating work with the software or for the software, that these activities are more complicated and bound up in each other. And so I was attracted to that idea because it describes some of what I do, which you'll see in a bit. And the other idea is that making isn't only for experts, that we don't have to know what it is that we're doing at the very beginning, that significant creative breakthroughs can happen just by engaging with this process. Even if we don't fully understand what's going on, we can observe interesting behaviors and emergence that comes out of just trying things. And so this is sort of an overarching idea about learning by making. And we could replace learning with like creating, right? Creating by making, but then it sounds sort of tautological. At any rate, when we're thinking about this, what we've really got is an experimental approach, and this approach goes against a lot of our typical educational training, and also the ideas that we have about the arts, which are generally about a model or an ideal. And what we're trying to do is match that model. So, you're told this is how you play a beautiful scale on the piano, and you work to play a beautiful scale on the piano. And that's great as long as our goal is, we already know our goal. But if we're interested in creativity and innovation, maybe we don't even exactly know where we're headed. We just know that we're moving in a direction. And so we need a new ideal that is perversely not really an ideal. And so that's why this learning by making is a way that I can use to short circuit that approach, where I can be comfortable, even if I'm not sure what it is that I'm supposed to be doing, that I'm actually doing something that I'm supposed to be doing. All right, big idea. And now let's get to some smaller ideas. And these are things that I like to keep behind me in my studio, like posted on the wall. So when I get stuck, I can think through what motivates my work. And an important one for me is that I'm interested in discovery and not interested in control. This is really a principle of experimental music and experimental artwork. And it leads to this idea of not knowing what it is that you're doing. And that's actually a desirable place to be in, the place of not knowing. So that's important to me. This doesn't have to be important to you. Let me say, like, I want you to come up with your own tenets that are really the things that drive you in your work. I just think that this is a neat way to start a conversation, because then you can see sort of where I'm coming from. And also by rehearsing these, by talking them through, it helps to continue to inform the work that I do. So this idea of discovery instead of control. There's another idea that I'm really interested in, which is that the network is more important than the hierarchy. And the thing that is important here is that the connections can take precedence over the individual ideas. So this shows up in my work. This is a score in progress for a piece that I wrote for the pianist Aaron Calais. It's called The History of Elevators in Film. And like a lot of my scores, and you'll see some of that later, there's a modular aspect to it. And the individual ideas aren't like earth-shattering ever. And maybe the connections aren't either, but the connections are what bring those things to life. And the connections and the network are really important to me. Okay, another idea that's very common in the world of experimental music is that landscape subsumes narrative. I don't have anything against storytelling. I love telling stories. I'm hoping that, as we're together today, there's some stories that come out of this, but my work doesn't have to be driven by this narrative element. I'm okay with work that is static, even if it's time-based work. It doesn't have to develop and change. It can just start or stop. It doesn't have to have a beginning and a middle and an end. Landscape works fine. Great. Let's just keep throwing these ideas at you. I'm really interested in things that emerge, epiphenomena. So, and this to me follows from the interest in landscape. If we push down narrative, then what else do we have to pay attention to? Well, we can pay attention to whatever the other qualities are that are here. And the secondary effects, things that sort of bubble up, are of interest to me. Someone who really points the way in this regard, I think, would be Alvin Lucier. And so I'm inspired by the natural world, and I often think that my job as a creator is to generate the conditions that are required for emergent behaviors to reveal themselves, to create a space within the work that allows for these kinds of happy accidents and surprises to step forward. So again, this goes back to the idea of not knowing, right? Allowing an open space for something to happen, and setting up the conditions where that thing can happen.
So let me pause you for a second there, because I love what we're looking at. So you put this slide here for a reason, and I just want you to elaborate about it, just in case we miss it.
Right. So this is actually at Yellowstone National Park, and it is a hot spring. And there's a local condition here where the temperature of the water and the chemical makeup of the rocks and material around it give rise to this bacteria. And the bacteria has a particular color. And if you take 2 steps backwards, you don't see that. It's only in this local place given this particular set of conditions. And so that kind of thing is interesting to me. These sort of micro ecologies are interesting to me. Does that help you figure out where the slide is there?
For me, yes, absolutely.
Good.
I think it's really interesting, that we talk about a ecological circumstance that's going to produce unique things.
Yeah. And I'm also interested in just putting a picture with an idea, because sometimes that generates a new idea. So, it doesn't have to be exactly a one-to-one relationship. Like if we're designing an interactive work, one-to-one relationships get old really, really easily. But if you can have an almost to one relationship or a one-to-many relationship, then that can be, it can give rise to more interesting ideas.
So also, since we're here, you mentioned epiphenomena, which is not something I'm really familiar with, and you mentioned it in conjunction with Alvin Lucier. But can you explain a little more about what you're talking about? That kind of just went over my head a little bit.
Sure, yeah. I love that you're jumping in, and for anyone else, right, we operate in interrupt mode, so interrupt is great. So epiphenomena are things that arise given a particular condition. So, and that would be, one way to think about it might be like phases of the moon. So because there's this system in place of these things orbiting and light reflecting in certain ways, we happen to see the phases of the moon. Now, the phases of the moon aren't a real thing, except from our particular perspective looking at them. So, and to go to maybe Lucier's work, a piece like Music on a Long Thin Wire, there's almost like a science experiment that's set up, an electromagnet, and this wire is being activated in a way, but the simple activation of the wire gives rise to all of these surprising behaviors that we would not have predicted. Does that make sense?
It does. It reminds me of a series of works I heard of Lucier where it's like a sine sweep oscillator and an instrument. And so what happens is, depending on where you're sitting in the audience, you're going to hear these sounds kind of in the air spiral off each other with these beating tones as the frequencies get close. It's very much like what you're talking about.
Right, yeah. And that's another example of epiphenomena, are the beating tones, the combination tones. So that's something that's appealing to me, that I try to engage with in my work. Okay, so and really we're coming to the end of these, because this doesn't need to be a lecture on aesthetics. We're coming to the end of these, but if we're open to discovery and accident and emergence, then that suggests that there's shared agency. If it's not about control, where I'm, say, the composer or the artist who dictates everything, but instead someone who sets up conditions for things to emerge, then what that means is I now have to recognize other people's agency. In fact, I want to recognize the agency of other people involved, the audience, the other performers, our collaborators, even if our collaborators are machines. And so also there's part of this that's like, do I want to make work that I would enjoy being part of? So there's this concept of shared agency, that we're all in this together, and we're gonna make something together, that I'm not the only one who's in control of my work.
So you like to create ecosystems, basically? Like you like to create your own ecosystems through your work?
Yeah, that's both, and that's a good way to put it. I'm oversimplifying it that way. I think that ecosystems are really, really complicated, and that I'm not good at that. But I prefer that perspective, right? Even if I may never actually get there.
Okay.
Yeah, good. So finally, the last thing that is important to me is that there's a responsibility of this agency, and the responsibility is that we pay attention. And this runs counter to a lot of musical training that's about virtuosity of execution. And I'm interested in virtuosity of attention and listening. So the collaborators that I want to have and the kind of audience that I want to have is an audience that can pay attention in a really, really interesting way and good way. And that this sort of active listening or active perceiving really trumps whatever sort of training that we've had as an instrumentalist or as a technician. So this is especially important when it comes to interactivity. When working with George Lewis early, this was in the late 90s, it was really clear that interactivity is an overstatement. And he makes this case that what we're really dealing with is reactivity. That we do something and then the computer responds in a way, and then the only way that loop gets closed is through us as audience members, and the loop gets closed because we are attentive to it, and because we are predicting what might be happening next, or surprised by what didn't happen, and so the idea of attention is really important if you're thinking about interactive work. And it's even more important on a basic level, because you can't be engaged in a sort of conversation with a partner if you're not listening to what's going on.
I think that's really interesting with regard to interactive works with a computer. Because I think, in a way, computers can play the most virtuosic things if we think of the old definition. But this idea of a computer being highly attentive is a very difficult thing to achieve.
Yes. And it's also, as George Lewis points out and many other people, when we start asking a computer to listen, we suddenly have to begin asking ourselves, well, what does listening mean? Why do I care about listening? What am I listening for? So I think we've likely had experiences with pitch trackers, and we realize that, the notion of pitch is way more complicated than what can be teased out through even our best algorithms.
Or context in general, right? The
Yeah.
context of a pitch it matters.
Exactly. Okay, so that's like the groundwork. This is sort of the ideas that I'm playing around with and targets that I'm aiming for. Let's look at specific things that I'm doing in this world or have done to see what happens, to see where we're at. In my creative life, my three-legged stool is sort of the arts, technology, and education. And a big part of what I do in the arts is about making instruments broadly defined. More recently, of course, I'm engaged as a composer and a performer, but as Dr. Thompson mentioned earlier, I'd like to work with this idea of an expanded instrument or a composed instrument that blurs the line between creating an instrument and a piece of music. And I've done this with a number of different instruments. My current obsession right now is with banjos. And so I have a few banjos that I have outfitted with some sensors. And you can see on the upper right, this is a force sensitive resistor on the head of the banjo where a player's fingers might go or might strike depending on how they're playing it. Also a piezo contact mic attached to the head because audio signals are really, really great sensors in a way. And then this is a view on the left that's on the inside of the banjo that just shows the ugly wiring. And if you look carefully, you can see there's a photoresistor attached onto the stick that goes through the pot of the banjo. In fact, there are 3 photoresistors so that the position of my hand along the head of the banjo can cast shadows or change the light as it falls on those sensors. And I'm using, what's now our standard, an Arduino, to convert this sensor data into serial information that gets passed to Macs where the data gets parsed and worked through. So that's sort of the technical setup. One thing that's important for me about this work is that I'm not interested in building a controller. I'm not interested in turning the banjo into a non-banjo. I want to continue to play it like a banjo and just have the computer know more about what's going on while I'm playing. There are times, of course, and what you didn't see is I have a pressure sensor along the neck, the back of the neck, and whoops, I also missed. There's a distance sensor, an infrared distance sensor you can see on the upper right there that senses the position of my left hand. But my interest in these sensors is to get sort of overall tendencies and gestures. I'm really not using them to press buttons, so to speak. So it's not like if I hit that pressure pad, we're going to hear a sound that happens, but instead I might track the overall pattern of when I'm touching or how I'm touching the pressure pad as a result of playing the banjo. Here's a brief excerpt of that. I was born and raised in East Virginia. And so what you hear there is, some pretty standard clouds of delays that are going on. And what's happening behind the scenes for us geeks is that the way in which I'm playing is changing the delay times of all these different delays based on how I play. And so as the piece progresses, I can sort of push it in this direction and sort of push it in that direction, but I'm never sure exactly what direction it's going to be in, right? This is discovery, not control. And every time that I play it, it's going to wind up sounding slightly different. This is a really active area for me. I continue to make a lot of work like this. Particularly interested in traditional Appalachian music, old time music, and these traditional banjo techniques, frailing or clawhammer banjo, 2-finger banjo. And I make my own compositions as well as arrangements of traditional tunes. Like this one is an arrangement of a traditional tune. So that's one thing that's going on. Here's a newer project to talk about. These are some instruments that I am designing and creating with digital fabrication techniques. And this is for a piece that's to be premiered by the percussion ensemble at Cal Arts in fall of 2021. Hopefully it would have been premiered earlier, but COVID. And the idea here is to use generative design techniques, particularly with these whistles, the cylinder shapes and that tree of whistles that you see there. And so I'm using some 3D modeling software, open source software called OpenSCAD, and which is really cool because it allows me to parameterize the designs of these models. So here's a very basic whistle module. It's about the size of a film canister. Remember film, and you tie it on the end of a string and swing it around. All of these are related to bull roarers or whistles or ancient instruments that you swing around ritualistically, and they produce sound. And what's fun about this is that I can put in a very simple equation for the volume, the size of this sphere, cylinder, and the volume of it is directly related to the pitch that it's going to create and the harmonics. And so that way I can specify the pitches that I would like and export this and print it on a 3D printer, for example. So this is another side of this playing with instruments to come up with new ways of making sounds. And taking this simple whistle, you can expand it into a recursive tree of whistles. So this is a standard branching algorithm that takes that whistle, and then you can, I specify the pitch relationship between each of these other smaller whistles to generate clouds of sounds that are harmonically or not harmonically related. And that specifies the size of each one of these sub-modules that then get stacked and stacked. And then it's a kind of design that might be tricky to make by hand, but is not hard at all for a 3D printer to execute. So that's another area of this sort of engaging with instruments that I'm playing around with right now.
This looks really amazing. I really like this.
Yeah.
And again, you know, it goes back to you're saying like how older instruments are played. So you have this link to traditions. I find this really interesting, and I wonder if you can maybe articulate for us how you square, for instance, folk music with interactive electronics.
Yeah. So it's easier for me to do that with folk music than it is with this sort of bull roar or whistle that is a murkier past. And the way that I square it is straightforward. The computer is really our folk instrument right now. For a while it was the banjo, then it turned into the guitar, you know, the piano maybe. There was this, our folk instrument is the approachable instrument that anyone can pick up and play. And right now, the number one folk instrument is clearly the laptop. And so what I'm doing is actually inverting the folk instrument paradigm, that the banjo is no longer the folk instrument. I'm taking that tradition and bringing it into our folk tradition of right now, which is making music with our electronic devices.
That's really well stated. It's great.
Cool. Okay, let's look at some compositions. Sometimes I don't perform my work. In fact, isn't it nice when other people perform your works for you? And there are a couple of tendencies that you'll see. Often these scores are modular. They are open form or have some sort of openness in the way that they're created. This is an older piece of mine. Gosh, it's like 15 years old by now, for a string quartet plus a cello soloist. This was premiered with Fred Longberg Holm, a really great improvising cellist. The title page is also a map of each of the movements, and it shows how the ensemble can choose to work their way through the piece. So there's no predetermined structure. They must play a certain number of movements for it to count as a performance, but they can even leave some material out. It's something I've been playing with for a while, is this idea that to have a complete performance of a work, you actually have to leave something out. And then the page that you see on the right is an example page from one of the movements that in this case is dealing again with modular structures and sort of repetitive cells and a little bit of graphic notation. Not all of the movements are like this. Some are more scored out than others. Some may only be text instructions. And here's a little bit of how it sounds. This was performed by the Austin New Music Co-op in Austin, Texas. And again, Fred Longberg-Holm is the cellist. Here's a more recent example. This is a work that has 3 parts to it, and performers begin by just choosing one of the phrases along the outside and then traveling in a clockwise motion. And then when they come back to where they start, they travel through the center of the diagram until they come back to where they start, and then they travel counterclockwise. So in a way, a very typical classical kind of structure, but always a little bit open. And these gestures that are called shadow is this idea of choosing your neighbor and having to predict what they're going to play before they play it, which involves mistakes, because no one ever quite gets it right, and adds a little bit of interest in there. This work was, the recording that I'm going to play is from the Amernay String Quartet based in Miami, Florida, and they just released this as a part of a 2 CD set featuring the music of Alabama-based composers. So I should mention that, this piece is for open instrumentation. It's for any kind of instrument who can, which can gliss from pitch to pitch, and it always has this G pitch in whatever current octave is available for that instrument, but the upper and lower pitches are at the discretion of the performer and the ensemble. So some performances of the work are very tight because they choose to do it that way, or the instruments have a more limited range that they can gliss, and other performances of the work expand to, you know, to giant chasms between these pitches. So the work is always a little bit different, but you can point to parts of it that have it belong to that same area. And that's, as you can tell, something that interests me. So that follows from Hummingbird.
I have a boring question.
Yeah, bring it on.
How did you make the score?
Oh yeah, great question. So sorry. So I love Lily Pond. I think Lily Pond is the greatest score engraving program that we have, and the most open and flexible. I would love to say that I did all of this in Lily Pond, but what I actually did, and maybe someday I'll know enough about it to really do that, but what I actually did was generate each of these cells, and Lily Pond can export them as SVG files, and then I can throw them into Illustrator and assemble them all together.
Well, the really beautiful score there. It looks really great. I like this geometrical pattern. But also, I would like to hear this for a French horn ensemble. I think would be great.
Great. Let's find one.
Let's find one.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about work that I do. Now we shift sort of toward the art side of the work that I do, thinking about installations and sound art, because it's not always work in the concert hall. And there's a couple of pieces to highlight. One is, sorry, this link isn't going to work, so I'm going to have to redo. We're going to have to open a link. Maybe while we're at it, I'm going to open two links. Great. Okay, I think you're seeing Mirror, Trace, and Tremble on my webpage now. Is that right?
Yes.
Great. So this was a work for the Southern Sonic Sound Art exhibit at the Contemporary Arts Center in New Orleans, and it was a collaborative project between myself, Tim Feeney, and Jane Cassidy. Jane Cassidy mostly, she's great with audio and a lovely composer, but mostly did the video, and Tim and I mostly did the sound. And so here are some installation views. We have 3 projection areas, and behind there you see there's a walkway. The walkway had metal railings, and so we attached transducers to the railings in order to activate the physical space. And so when you walked into the installation, the sound, it was hard to tell exactly where it was coming from because it was sort of emanating from the structure around the video. And here you can see visitors, holding the handrail, and they could feel the vibrations. That went well with, there's part of the imagery is of river traffic and tugboats, and so these really low sorts of sounds were there. Let's see if there's a picture of, oh, we're so cute. There's Jane and Tim and myself. Let's see if a video works. Oh man, I just tested this the other day. Really? Okay. Nope. Sorry.
I love seeing the audio programmer come up there. Are you in the Discord?
Yeah. Exactly. Got to study up, always learning.
Isn't that the truth?
So here's another project that I did in the early 2000s. I've long been fascinated and a fan of the work of Marcel Duchamp, and I think that his work with Hidden Noise that you see in the upper right is one of the touchstones of sound art. It's a sculpture that's one of his semi-ready-mades that has these brass plates with inscriptions on them, sandwiching a ball of twine. And Duchamp's patron, Walter Ahrensberg, put an unknown object inside of that. So when you shake it, you can hear, it makes a sound. And this was always really interesting to me, and I was so happy to actually get to go to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where it's part of their extensive Duchamp collection. And of course, I found it inside a glass vitrine where you can't actually pick it up and move it around. And there was no recording of the sound that it made. There was, right, I mean, now thanks to the interwebs, you can find a recording of it. But I decided I'm just going to make my own replica. And instead of putting an unknown object in there, I'm going to put some sensors in there. So what you see in the bottom of the screen is some accelerometers and tilt switches. And this allows the object, the sculpture itself, to become a kind of controller. And so people can visit the gallery, they find it sitting on a pedestal surrounded by 4 speakers, and as they pick it up and interact with it, it makes sounds that relate to Marcel Duchamp's work. And so here's an excerpt of that.
Decide, débarrasser, live, viver, tira, bargain, sharp, tenue, osquille, tenue, bosquet, lake, desert, head, lake.
So that's just one sort of area that you can find your way in using that piece. It takes you to lots of different places depending on how it's been used before you got there and the way in which you handle the object. This is less interactive, but it changes over time. This piece is kind of a one-liner. The Song of the Strawberries is a pun from Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde, the Song of the Earth. And this piece uses some simple sensors to measure the conductivity of the strawberries as they rot. So there are 2 bowls of strawberries, one that's more fresh than the other. And eventually the fresh ones rot and the rot ones get replaced with fresh ones. And the information from these sensors drives a synthesis engine that creates this droney sound that is drawn from samples of Mahler's piece. This was shown, this documentation comes from the exhibit, a Wired Kingdom exhibit at the Arts Center of the Capital Region in Troy, New York. And here's an excerpt of what you might hear if you visited the Rotten Strawberries. And the sound, of course, would change very gradually over time.
Would you say that piece is a little bit like irreverent? Is that kind of an art about art thing, or is it more experimental?
It is irreverent because it's basically a pun, right? Das Lied von der Erdbeeren is a pun. It's also not correct grammar. That was pointed out to me, but that's Duchampian too, playing with grammar and puns. So yeah, it's a jape, right? I mean, it's one of those things where you're like, oh, wouldn't that be fun to do? And so do it. And that's what I did. And, but it doesn't, so you can go and look at it and you can go, aha, that's funny. But you can also look at it and think about, okay, now we're experiencing decay, which has a long history in art, right? To represent decay and the transience of life. We're showcasing that in a way that we haven't before.
Would you say are you still exercising an element of craftsmanship when you do something tongue in cheek like that? Or is it like both things at once, or?
Oh no, I want whoops, sorry. I want it to be, there is craftsmanship here, right? Like this is a sonic object, but it's also a sculptural object. I want the speakers to blend into the pedestal and the bowls to sit on top of the speakers and to have this sort of science, this sort of elementary school science experiment look about finding these right connectors that, you know, so it is an object that I hope is working in a number of different aesthetic ways.
So
But it's okay for it to be funny too. Go ahead.
No, I'd say, so you built this to be playful. You built this, you built this setup to be like, I look at it immediately and I'm like, oh, what child made this? I don't know. But sorry, I didn't mean that.
Oh, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Because what is it connected to? So it's
it's connected to an Arduino that's running a max patch that's transforming this sample. It's basically the first triumphant French horn notes of Mahler's piece. So
is this more like the ecosystem that you were talking about before? Because you were saying like you couldn't reach that level. And
yeah,
so,
you know, yeah, I think you might have made a connection that I've never really made here, but you're right. There's all kinds of, there's so much biology going on here that I'm not in control of, that I'm harnessing.
Right. I mean, that's bacteria. I mean, that's bacteria basically living off of that. And you're getting the signals from something you don't even can see.
Yeah.
So anyway, I find it really interesting. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Duchamp. We had a conversation about this recently because sometimes I compare Duchamp's ready-mades to sort of like musique concrète. And there was a little bit of criticism about that. It's like, well, is that really what he's doing, or is he doing something else? Because musique concrète wants to take these sounds and divorce them from their signification. And it's unclear whether Duchamp is really trying to do that, or whether he has a different intention in mind.
Yeah, I think of John Oswald as someone who's close to Duchamp in that way. In the way that he wants you to know where the sound comes from and to consider that at the same time you consider the new thing that was created from it.
Right. I don't think there's anything in Duchamp's mind that doesn't want you to know it's a urinal when he puts it in the art
Exactly.
museum.
Yeah. So a couple of other examples. I have an ongoing collaboration with poet Hank Lazar. Again, Jane Cassidy worked with us on this piece. This is the second version of a piece that we've done called Brush Mind. This is Brush Mind Second Hand. And Hank has a tradition of making poetry as well as writing with brush. And so there's a visual aspect to his writing that we're highlighting, and then I'm providing a kind of soundtrack to it. So this is closer to like scoring a film, even though pages of a poetry book may not be necessarily considered what we would think of when we think of movies. This is an installation view of it, and it also has on the right side another piece of mine called Pink Noise that has a visual and a sound element to it. So, and if you're interested in these pieces or want to know more, you can check out my website and you can see the work there. Sometimes the work that I'm doing is really just plain straight up visual work, right? Visual art. I'm really lucky that my position at the University of Alabama is in New College, which is an interdisciplinary department where students come to design their own majors. And our faculty typically have cross appointments in other colleges. So my cross appointment is actually in art and art history. And that visual side really ties into the work that I do there and with the students there. And of course, because of my training, music training, I continue to have a foot in the music world, but this, like being able to work in an interdisciplinary context is really, really important for me. My advanced degree is an MFA, a fine arts degree rather than a music degree, even though I would say sound-based work is the bulk of what I do. Okay, sometimes I work with visual stuff. Here's a piece that's called A Work of Art for Every Entry in Index Subjects Library of Congress. And it exists in two forms. This is as a sculptural element. It's a small LED display that's about the size of a 4x6 note card. And it actually looks like a note card. And this is an example of database art. I will show you the other form that it exists, and that is as a website. So here's our title page. And what happens is it will randomly generate a new description of a probably as yet uncreated work of art. So it mashes up the artistic media with a depiction and an entry from the subject matter database of the Library of Congress system. And this is kind of like an interest in, I'm interested in sort of how we organize the world, the way we think about systems of knowledge.
How we categorized everything.
How we categorize things, exactly. And there's, this is purely aleatoric, it's purely random, it's just, there's no fancy AI going on here. It just grabs one thing from column A, one thing from column B, one thing from column C, and finds some words to string them together, and then displays this. It's generated anew each time, so I can't really tell what it's gonna come up with.
Do you use this yourself if you ever find a lull in your creative process?
Well, this actually grew out of a tool that I made in Max. This is running using processing or P5JS, but sometimes when I'm writing lyrics, I developed a tool in Max where I would throw a bunch of words in and use Markov chains to mash up the words and scramble the sentences together. Again, really not high level semantic stuff, but just to see what happens, because sometimes it's just nice to see what just be, you know, it's like thumbing through a dictionary and something stands out and you're like, oh, I could use that. So there's a little bit of a practice that I have where it's playing with words in this way, although the end result isn't as aleatoric as this piece actually is.
Yeah, this is kind of like not very oblique strategies, if you wanted to take it that way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Actually, I am working on a piece right now, and I don't have it quite finished yet, where the lyrics, it's a blues tune, and so it's really standard and straightforward, but the lyrics are going to be generated in real time. So when I perform it, I'm not going to know what the lines are that I'm going to sing exactly until I'm going to know the world that they live in, right? I'm going to choose the combinations of words, but then I'm going to press the button and here come the lyrics for the next verse, and I'm going to have to make it fit. At least that's what I'm working on right now. Yeah.
I do have a quick question of your compositional style towards the end. Just remind me to ask that.
Oh, okay, great. Let's see. So let's get back to the presentation here. Here's another example of some visual work. This is a piece called A Catalog of Imaginary Flags. The idea here is that I created some software that allows the visitor to the gallery to design their own flag. And once they're done designing their flag, they can save their design. It's a really simple version, like a watered down version of Photoshop. And they start with flag templates, so they can start with choose a flag that they want to build from, and then substitute symbols and colors and move things and rotate things. And And then the flags, when they get generated, they're also posted to a Twitter account. Since this isn't an active work right now, the Twitter account is unfortunately pretty quiet, but I'm gonna crank it back up, I hope. So that's a different side. Again, it's purely visual. You go to a gallery. This doesn't exist as an online piece yet, although that might be a direction to move in. So that's another thing. And finally, some work that I'm doing currently is really about visual. It's about mark making, right? This is about gesture. But it relates to sound in that I'm creating drawings by driving them with sound, but also because the way these drawings are created is via simulations of many, many particles in a virtual space that are attracted to virtual black holes or repelled from virtual anti-black holes to create these patterns. And I'm really thinking about this as a system for augmented drawing, where I'm making drawings, but instead of drawing with a single pencil, I'm drawing with thousands and thousands of pencils and accreting these lines over time. And I've begun using this as visualizations too, where if I'm playing or someone else is playing, then the way in which I'm playing will spawn particles in different ways. And this is again work in progress, so it's not totally there yet. The next month, the violin duo Mia Lena is going to do an online concert, and a piece that they recorded of mine for violin duo and live electronics will also have this sort of visualization attached to it. So
was this done in Max as well?
This was not. I tried. This was done in processing. I tried. I really had fun working with jitter and the physics objects in jitter but the way that I had built enough of this in processing that it just, in order to get back to that in Max, would take me a whole lot of work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And with the magic of OSC, it's easy enough to just send a bunch of messages over to processing, and then it takes care of the visual side.
We're working with jitter right now. Most of us are in a class right now working, our first time working with jitter and working with that kind of software. So that's really cool to see, like an actual piece, a modern piece, work with this.
Great. So Dr. Thompson suggested that talking a little bit about arts entrepreneurship might be helpful. So
I'm very curious to hear
Yeah.
your take on this.
Okay.
Because you've mentioned it to me before, and now I have you pinned
Yeah.
down to talk about it at length.
That's right.
So.
At length. I was just checking my watch to see how we're doing. We've got another half hour easy, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. And we want time for conversation, so I'll go quick about this.
Well, there are some questions in the chat, but I think I'm going to wait till after the arts entrepreneurship.
All right, great. So by the way, this is such a great series. It's so great to look at the videos and the people who have already spoken and to jump in. I had a chance earlier this week to do that, and it was really fun. And last week, Michael Olson talked extensively about entrepreneurship, and we have a lot of shared opinions here and approaches, but I'm going to have a slightly different take on his. That like the beginning of our chat together is maybe a little more conceptual than like at the practical level dealing with music licensing, for example, but that's all right. So one way that I like to think about arts entrepreneurship is broadly. I want it to be a big tent for lots of different practices. And so Jeremy Deller, the artist Jeremy Deller, is interesting in this way, where he makes this distinction between making things and making things happen. And I think that works great. And so we spend a lot of our time training ourselves about how to make things and learning how to make things, and whatever those things are, right? Pictures, sculptures, movies, dances, it doesn't matter. We work on making these things. And then there's the moment where the rubber hits the road and we have to do something with those things. And so that's the moment that I call arts entrepreneurship. So this is not just about revenue streams and selling your work. To me, arts entrepreneurship is an approach that's more about how do you engage with other people and get other people to engage with your work. And so this expansive definition of arts entrepreneurship could include social practice art that is aimed not so much at making objects, but more about engaging people. It could involve all kinds of outreach activities that we typically see cultural institutions do. And it can also involve all sorts of what we would think of as typical entrepreneurship activity by individual artists, starting a label or having a podcast or opening your own studio or whatever. So this is sort of the broad approach that I want to think about when we talk about arts entrepreneurship. When I talk to people, you just meet someone on the street and they're like, hey, nice to meet you. And what's that arts entrepreneurship thing? This is what they think about. They think like arts entrepreneurship is the world of art, which is in purple, and the world of money, which is in green. And it's where those two things meet. That's like the thing that happens when I look at someone in the eyes and say, oh, arts entrepreneurship, right? I see these two circles merging. What they're really imagining is not arts entrepreneurship, though. That's actually the art market. The art market is huge too, right? This is every movie that's ever been made. This is every concert you've attended. This is music for commercials. This is everything that happens from scenic design to straight up sculpture that goes in a gallery. Like, this is the art market, and it's a big thing. We love the art market. Art market is tough in COVID right now, but I try to make a distinction with my students that the art market is different from arts entrepreneurship, that arts entrepreneurship is actually the space just outside of these circles and just outside of where these circles overlap that allows us to think about how do we come up with a new art practice. That's an entrepreneurial approach to art, even if it might not involve the exchange of money. Or how do we come up with a new way to market or commodify the arts, which would be expanding the green circle into the purple circle? That's an arts entrepreneurship thing too. And this is tricky because as soon as we do something, it stops being entrepreneurial anymore. It becomes co-opted into the art market, right? So who would have thought, oh yeah, I'm gonna sell my music online, right? At one point, that was a very entrepreneurial thing to do. The art market didn't include this idea of selling directly to listeners. But now that's not entrepreneurial. In the same way that, say, opening a pizza restaurant wouldn't be considered entrepreneurial, right? I mean, it's a fine thing to do. It's great to be a small business owner, especially if you love pizza, but let's not confuse it with coming up with a brand new venture. So there's where we're sort of defining our terms. Is that good? Okay.
It's good. I'm tempted to look up this Brian Eno quote, because to me, what you're talking about resonates with something I read him say, which was stop thinking about art as an object. And it kind of relates to what you're talking about, this other art practice, which is not the creation of the object, which I think is really important. And I also think about smaller things, people that have to do composition recitals. you write all these pieces. Well, that's the 25% of it. And then the other 75% is what you're talking about. Like, how are you going to get people to do this?
Right.
How are you going to get people to go to your recital?
Right. And when we stop thinking about art as an object and think about it as the entire process, what actually happens is we realize that art, those skills that we're developing go way beyond art, and are actually the skills that our businesses need. They need those skills in order to imagine and create and reach new people and communicate. So speaking of business, you just can't, even with this broad approach, we can't talk about arts entrepreneurship, and we don't want to without thinking about sort of the world of business and commerce. And so the problem is that there are these bugaboos that we have. There's so much importance put on these things about, is it profitable? Is it scalable? Is it marketable? Do you have an exit strategy? And if you've spent any time around entrepreneurs, you've heard all these terms, you know, I'm going to scale, man. And how much runway have you got? And all of this. And I say, this is crap for the arts. This is all bullshit. Do not think about these terms in that way for the arts. It just doesn't apply. And so let's take these terms and turn them into features for working in the arts. Instead of thinking about, is something profitable? Let's think about, is something rewarding? And that can be rewarding for a lot of people, including just yourself personally. Not, is it scalable? In other words, are we really going to take this thing and make millions of them and sell them to every household across the globe? No, we're not interested in doing that as artists. We want sustainable careers. So how can we get this thing that's going to keep us going, and not just going for 5 years, but for 20 years and for 40 years until we retire? When we think about, is it marketable? I'd rather think about, who's the community? Which audiences are we talking to? Who are we in conversation with? And instead of an exit strategy, which is a fancy way of saying, I'm going to build a company and then sell it to somebody else for a whole lot of money and then go retire. We don't want to do that as artists, right? I don't want to make a bunch of stuff and sell it to somebody else and retire. I want to keep going. And in fact, what I want is the opposite of an exit strategy. I want an entrance strategy so that I can champion other people to be there who do cool work when I'm long gone and dead. So this is reframing our business think into the world of the arts and into human kind of values. Great. Now let's talk about the practical stuff, right? All right. So we really do want to make a living in the arts. It's important to us. And so I want us to talk through these 4 things: expectations, ideas about a portfolio, prototypes, and doing it together. And the first is to reconfigure our expectations about what it means to work in the arts. We carry a lot of baggage from the Romantic era about artists as unreliable, drug-addled, people who are in touch with another reality and are touched by genius. And that just doesn't take you very far, at least not past 5 years. And so we need to think more about, what is it that we're really going to do day in and day out? And one of the maybe freeing things, but maybe surprising things, is that even very successful artists don't spend as much time as we think they do just making their work. That there's all this other stuff that we have to do instead of just making our work. Filling out paperwork and doing our taxes. Here's Elizabeth Baker, who came to speak with my students. She's showing them some of the gear that she uses. And during this exchange, one of my students said to her, "Oh, I think it is so cool that you make your living playing music." And Elizabeth responded sort of this way, and I paraphrase because I didn't write it down exactly. "I love playing music. It's great being up on stage, but that's not my job. That's not how I make my living. I make my living sending emails and driving to the gig. So when we think about our expectations of working in the arts, it's one of the things we were thinking about is what's really your job? Are you, when you say, I love dance, and so I'm going to start a dance studio, you need to realize that your job really at that point is not going to be dancing. It's going to be getting people to come to your studio and doing all the marketing and paying the bills and repairing the roof when it starts to leak and all the dumb things you have to do to keep a dance studio running. And so it's important to just think through that. Like, what do you really want your job to be? And in that sense, maybe not everyone needs to be an entrepreneur, right? Not everyone needs to be a leader, or else we won't have anybody left for them to lead. And so you can think through, what do you really want your job to be? That leads us to another idea, which is that most artists have multiple sources of income. And commonly people talk about this in terms of your portfolio, right? Your sources of income go beyond what it is that you think that you're doing. Remember when I said earlier, I was like, I've got a three-legged stool, right? I don't just make instruments and do the arts, and I don't just do technology work, and I don't just teach. It's about combining these things together. And so you can think about your portfolio. What is it that you do? What skills do you have? What do you know and want to know more about? And how is it that you can earn a little bit here and there and there? And when I say earn, remember, we're talking about rewards that aren't always just money, right? Earn can be, how is it that my skills can help me collaborate with really interesting people so that everybody can do great stuff together.
Can I ask a question about,
yeah.
Where is this sign?
This sign is at the Atlantic Center for the Arts in Florida.
So they do residencies, and this would be a notice to them.
Right. And I think
stop.
Yeah, on the path right before this would be a sign for visitors that say, like, thank you for coming to visit the Atlantic Center for the Arts. If you're not an artist in residence, please don't go beyond this point. And then if you go beyond that point, you see the next sign that says, please go beyond this point. And so I'm thinking, how is it that we go beyond the way that we think of ourselves? You know, okay, I'm trained as a clarinetist. I guess my entrepreneurial thing is going to be to play the clarinet, right? And that doesn't get us very far. So how can we expand our portfolio to think about more of what we're doing together? And some of this really is about investing. And investing is a long game and it's a slow game. This is also the Atlantic Center for the Arts. Here's a turtle or a tortoise. I can't remember which, probably a tortoise. And you are investing right now as students because you're learning stuff. You're investing your time and your money in education. You have already invested a lot as artists because you've taught yourself skills and you've put in hours and hours in practice rooms and working on technique. And so this idea of investing for the long term isn't foreign to you. And it's an idea that just needs to continue on. Maybe this is literally investing, right? I believe in the work that I'm doing, and so I'm going to take X number of dollars and put it aside so that I'll have it for when I'm retiring, because if you're an entrepreneur, no one else is going to be thinking about your retirement but you. Maybe it's not literally investing money, but it's more about investing your time and your energy in the things that you care about. There's another, yeah, go ahead.
Sometimes I request that people invest a little bit in programming.
Yes.
You know, just take, because you know it's a 10-year pursuit to become fluent, really.
Right.
But for a long view, it's a good investment, I think, although it may not be for everybody.
Right. Yep. So this brings up an idea that I talk to my students about, which is analogous ventures. If you're going to make a portfolio, if they can be related somehow, then this is great. So what's your main work, creative work, and how can you find things that are analogous to that work, so that you're operating within a world that's related to each other, right? I mean, what you don't want to do is deliver pizzas. There's nothing wrong with delivering pizzas, but it would be better if you could do the equivalent of delivering pizzas that's somehow related to your work. So in my case, over time, I've worked in arts administration. I've done grant writing. I've run my own business where I provided technology solutions to artists, making software and hardware solutions for them. I've certainly done a lot of teaching. I love teaching. I've done website development, maybe less analogous, but we all need a website. Running sound for live audio. I bet some of you have done some of these things already, doing location recording or doing post-production work. So all of these can be analogous ventures. And none of them would be the thing that I run my flag up and say, I'm your post-production person. But that doesn't mean that, that given the right situation, I can't do some post-production work and have it be part of my sort of portfolio of work that I do that helps sustain my life and my career. So that's what I mean by analogous ventures. And I challenge you to think about, beyond this narrow definition, what are your analogous ventures?
Well, so I have a struggle with this personally where, I teach music lessons in a previous life, and there's been some lessons where I'm like, well, one, that wasn't a musical experience. It was childcare, right? And two, it's at a certain point, I'd rather bartend than teach lessons. And it's like, well, yeah, I get to call myself Mr. Musician if I do the lessons, but is it really worth it to me? It's not even really inspiring sometimes.
Right. Yeah. And that goes back to this question, what's really your job? And so when having that experience is a great one to have, because now you know that doing individual lessons for students, particularly students of an age, may not be the thing that's going to be the thing for you, right? As a satisfying analogous venture. But tweaking that, maybe the thing is that you can provide materials for other teachers, or maybe you teach adult learners.
Well, I guess because what you said,
or you tend to bar.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
what you said spoke to experience I've had a lot with anything in the music or creative industries. It's like, you just got to be involved with it. And people are like, well, I was working the door at a club that I liked. But I'm wondering, like, I'm not just obsessed with just music in the sense where it's like, oh, I like this just because it's tangentially related to music. And so I don't know, maybe it does seem like you can be kind of a la carte. Maybe there's more dimensions to the music industry than I thought before or something.
I think there's always more dimensions. And so, that's a challenge as creative people. How do we find those other areas that are there? I love your comment, though, because it sets up the next point, which is me contradicting myself, because this is complicated, right? So let me give you the opposite advice. I taught adjunct at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute when Pauline Oliveros was there. And one day I ran into her in the hall and I was picking her brain about this grant proposal, because I was like, you've got a lot of experience with this and maybe you could give me some guidance. And the guidance she gave me was, be careful what you get good at. In other words, if you spend all your time writing grants and you're good at that and people recognize it, they're going to call you up to write more grants, and you better damn well be ready to write some grants. And I thought that was really interesting. So, at the same time that I want to tell you, find all these other ways to work because it's going to take more than one, it's also important to recognize that not every way that you're going to work is going to be a way that fits who you are and what you want to be and where your goals are, and that we need to be careful about what we get good at, right? So if it's important for us to keep developing our creative work, we'll keep our focus on our creative work, even as we work through these other things. So I realize I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. That's absolutely on purpose. Okay, very quickly, this concept, there are two other things. There's this concept of a prototype, which is a way of saying, giving yourself permission to try things and not being precious about it, considering everything that you do as a work in progress, that even the work that you think is your greatest work actually turns out just to be sort of like a rehearsal for the next work that you're doing. And so what we want to do, we're literally framing our work here. The principle is to keep our investment and our overhead low with a prototype. Try something without spending 10 years just getting it off the ground. Use simple tools and do it cheaply, just to get a taste of whether there's anything there or not. And so that's just a concept to sort of file away, is this idea of the prototype. That helps me finish work, because I have a problem actually finishing the work that I do. I think a lot of creative people do that. And so this concept of having a prototype, having it be a prototype, helps me know, okay, I can be done enough and I can move on to the next thing. And that works beyond creative work. It also can work for entrepreneurial work. A podcast can be a prototype. A video series, some live streams that you do. That's a way of prototyping ideas. Just wanted to put that idea out there. And then finally, I want to close with a mistake that I've made. I love DIY. I think it's great. And as an ethos, as a sort of like, yay, we can get things done, it's really cool. But there's a danger in DIY. And the danger is that you're all by yourself. And you don't want to do everything all by yourself. We hear that a lot in the music world right now. People are like, there's no better time to be a musician because you don't need any of these gatekeepers anymore. And you can record and produce and mix and master and release and design and tour. You can do everything all by yourself. And it's like, no, that is a hassle. That's too many jobs for one person to do and do well. And when we want an ecosystem in the arts, we want an ecosystem that includes lots of people and lots of approaches. And there's room for people whose job is to book shows, and room for people whose job is to plan tours. So when we think about DIY, it's great, like get in there and do it and prototype. My suggestion is that we do it together, though. And especially bringing other voices in who we haven't heard before, collaborating. As students, you have a really great opportunity to leverage your community right now, because there are people around you who are doing great work and they need sound, or they need image, or they need help with their projects, and you can help each other out. And I point to collectives. I've been involved with starting or working with collectives, artist collectives and collaboratives, like the Birmingham Art Music Alliance, like the Austin New Music Co-op I mentioned, like the Albany Sonic Arts Collective, that we do good work together when we work together. And that one thing to think about is that when we do it together, we're not really competing, even though it seems like we're all doing the same thing. Like, why do I want to hang out with a bunch of other weirdo experimental musicians or sound artists? Aren't they just gonna hone in on my territory? But everybody is different. We're all doing a different thing. And we need to think of ourselves as partners instead of as competitors.
Well, it's a fantastic talk. Thank you very much. Particularly fond of your angle on entrepreneurship, which to me resonates well. There were some questions in the chat that I want to read out to you so you can address them. And this goes back a little way.
Sorry, I'm cognizant of time too. So
let's see. Do you feel that, and I think this is in regard to interactive music, do you feel that having a lack of control or maybe a level of chaos gives the instrument more character in terms of what a performer can discover about an instrument? I think it was Atao Tanaka who said that if a performer can figure out everything there is to figure out about an interactive instrument, then it loses its level of expressivity. Do you think that the level of uncontrollability gives you that level of expressivity in developing these electronic instruments and performing with them?
I think that that's a really good point. I'm not sure that I would put it exactly that way. And I'm not sure why I would put it exactly that way. When I think about a non-interactive instrument, like a really fun instrument to play, an acoustic instrument, it's not that it's unpredictable, it's that there's a kind of complexity to the system. And there's a feedback, there's a really great feedback loop there, where if I make a gesture and I get a sound and I change that gesture in some way, there's a richness that happens there. So in some ways, I think interactivity maybe is a standalone for that richness when it comes to electronic instruments. But having an element of unpredictability also helps me be there in the moment and be more active in what's happening. If that, I think maybe that's more my primary goal with interactivity, is that I want to be rooted there and have an experience that I wouldn't have had if I were just going through the motions.
I guess to give some context, the person who asked that question is developing a system whereby what the computer does isn't necessarily known to you. It's a little unpredictable. And another question was, when you write out paths, do you consider every path they will follow, and then you take the time to play through every path to make sure they work? So that's in reference to your...
reference to the scores. I do consider it, but I can't consider every path. And I encourage them to find their way through the paths. My feeling is if I plan it out all the way, then I should just notate that score, right? That should just become the score. And instead, I want there to be some negotiation as an ensemble. I want there to be conversation. I want there to be a way in which they're going to work together to figure their way through this experience.
So you're building the, I guess, yeah, I keep going by the ecosystem, but you're building the roadmap, and you're just doing the destination in the beginning. You're not telling them how to get there.
Usually, right? They're like in that string piece, it's very much the destinations, and the instructions say something like, improvise your way into the next place. And some performances are, depending on the performer, they go straight there, and others might meander into territory I never knew existed.
But is that why you keep everything very simple? Because that's why you can't really do super complex ideas and not have one of those work.
Right. Well, I wouldn't, yeah. I think that, I don't know that that's why I keep everything simple. Maybe it's because I don't know how to do it anymore, do it any better. Right?
Right.
I'm just not very good at that. The other thing is not every piece has that very simple modular structure. Sometimes it's more complicated gestures and then it goes to something else. So,
okay.
And for the piece, for example, the piece with the bull roars and whistles, that piece has a different procedure for moving from movement to movement. But often those procedures are about, now in that piece, those procedures are about signaling to other performers and about cueing and about listening and responding. So I've set up a system for it to happen, but I'm not exactly sure how it's going to happen.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our time. But you can reach Holland Hopson via email, and I'm sure he'd be happy to speak for him here. I'm sure he'd be happy to respond if you have questions that come up that you didn't get to ask.
Love to be in touch.
Me too. It's been too long. I'm sorry we've had to cancel the root signals thing for a while now, especially with the COVID thing. It didn't give us a chance to bounce back. But we hope to have you in person here as soon as all of this mess resolves itself to an acceptable degree, which looks like what we can look forward to. And you're just right down the road. So
That's right.
thank you very much again. I'll let you have the final word.
Well, the final word is thanks and another invitation, right? Reach out to me, talk to me. I'd love to be in touch. So appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, well, thank you very much.